you chair Aloisio session. So it's a pleasure. Aloisio Araujo is a very good friend. I remember a moment many years ago when we met. He's a distinguished economist, and Aloisio is a special type of economist because his academic work is very highly mathematical, a bit like Jose, but Jose is following on the pathways of Aloisio. You know, people that do very highbrow theoretical work, extremely sophisticated, but also get a real interest in practical matters, in social issues, in what economists are actually supposed theoretically to be concerned with. So Jose does it from Colombia, Aloisio does it from Rio and Brasilia, and it's been, if I understand, quite involved in recent years with Brazilian political decision-making, especially monetary policy, but he was just telling me that he's very proud about some achievement. Maybe he will tell us about VAT taxes and the way they're being modeled in the country, right? So you're going to talk about, new title, A Moderately Optimistic View of Brazil. That's good, a moderately optimistic view. I think we need it these days, right? Optimistic views are not going around. How's the market doing today? Collapsing another day? Another? Well, good. So buy and sell. All right, so Aloisio, please. I think I did my introductory part. I'll listen to you.
Thank you, Megale. Thank you, Manuel, for inviting me here. So after so many years, we meet. No, he invited me to Spain. I invited him to Rio, and then once in a while we talk and work similar problems long time ago. And then it's a great pleasure to be here. And the introduction of Megale is great. So I changed the titles because Manuel keeps giving me insight. You should go, you do whatever you want, but you do whatever you want. But so I chose this title at the end, okay? At some point, I was going to have a very academic paper about inflation targeting. It is in the YouTube, right? I did 2 years ago, so if you press there, everything's detailed, and it's to appear the paper in the AJ Macro. Perhaps the paper, the modern version, is already there in the. If not, I sent to you. But I decided to do more interesting, you know? And I put my take there in Brazil since the beginning, right? Moderately optimistic, right? So it's not you're not near the cows or anything. Perhaps you are, but you've always been, and there's always escape, possible escape. So but anyhow, that's what I'm talking about, okay? Also, most of you know me, like Megale, you know, from this very abstract work in general equilibrium, optimization, and then dynamic economics, and this, probability theory, right, as a mathematician. But for the last 25 years, not a short time, I've been involved in advising, particularly the last 6 years, even more, right? But it goes back to early millennia, no? Something like that. So I'm going to talk about several things, and then please interrupt me. So let me start. That's one of the things when I said. Perhaps you talk about how Brazil developed academically in economics, no? I start with the talk that I gave in 1990, more or less. In Brazil, the Economists Association, they invite one person to be honored. And they chose me there. And when I thought, again, please, don't take it too serious. It looks like I was dishonored the economic profession. But anyhow, that was not my intention. My intention is to compare Brazil, well, I mean, the last country in Latin America to have a university system, no, only 20th century, very late, 100 years after Argentina, primary education, basic education was mandatory, exactly 100 years after Argentina. So it was start very late in all this. And then I decided to do, I compare, but then in science in general, Brazil had improved. So I collect some data, I try to remember a little bit. I make the comparison between in mathematics and physics, both of them gave the same result. Brazil was bigger than Mexico plus Argentina plus Chile, because the population added together was a little less or perhaps the same as Brazil, something like that. But was smaller, I expect, England or France. As expected again, right? So to check that. And these were the scientific publication in the previous 10 years. That means 1980 to 90. So in top 10, something like that. And then I did in economics. Brazil was smaller than Mexico, or Chile, or Argentina. Either one, Brazil was smaller, although the population was much bigger. And Brazil, obviously, is, for sure, smaller than England or France. But so economics was much lagging behind than the other fields, scientific fields. Economics in general is very concentrated in the US, a little bit in Europe, so, but compared with Latin American countries, even that Brazil was behind. So nowadays, Brazil has 3 of the 4 best research centers. Perhaps don't throw, it's good that no Argentinians or Mexicans are wrong, but 3 of the 4 best, perhaps, this criteria, Tilburg, or whatever you get. There's several very good centers, okay? Colombia improved. Argentina is great economist, its time more in the US, but not as many in Argentina. So it's changed the scenario. Nowadays you have better economists, I think. And that's important, I think, because my view in this talk here will be very clear that we need thinking to do reforms. It's just not copying. Many economists say, no, copy this. This is already there. Many good economists say, oh, the analysis has been done, the diagnosis has been done, it's just a question of implementing it. I say, no, everything is a big problem. Because big countries have very diversified interest groups, have very much interaction between the laws. I'm going to talk about the Mussolini law that was, since old time, it was still prevalent in Brazil. And then the labor law and the bankruptcy law, for example, was from a very old time. So you need people to think. That's my view. Okay, it doesn't come from free. And even the inflation target that I'm going to concentrate more in the inflation target towards the end. Okay, but in the last education, it's very important also. Increase in the years of education, constant quality. One, it didn't increase productivity as expected. Okay, I know that. I know my answer is, and I have a little less pessimistic view, as always, okay? Because I think I invented something different way of measuring productivity, okay? I use Sharon Rosen idea that people like to be alive. So you consume the goods, but the probability of being alive is important also. And that's affect how much you invest in health. That extends your lifespans. So if you measure that way, I have a paper with students, I never published it. I hope I publish it sometime soon, I think. But its situation is a little better, right? Brazil is less behind than France or the US, as a matter of fact. Life expectancy than in the traditional good. So if you measure productivity only the traditional, is in the Ramsey model, I like to measure in sharing way. I find very creative paper. But anyhow, very important. In the 80s, in the late 80s, in the middle 80s, organized many meetings, mentored by Jim Heckman. Okay, I talked with Jim. I said, no, Jim, I was very excited about early childhood, the Heckman curve, the returns for investing early is much better than later, Heckman equation curve or whatever. And so I said, we have to bring that to Brazil. Brazil have to do many things, okay? And then we had these big meetings. I published a book. No, I coordinated a book. I didn't wrote it. Okay, I coordinated. Published by the Brazilian Academy of Science. It was a little bit copied by the National Academy of Science. They were, but it's not the same thing. But the initial idea was to do something similar. But and then the government implemented it. The current finance minister. And since then, it become closer. And Sérgio Firpo, recently I measured it with Portela and Ogava, and he was a debater, so please don't do your criticism now, but at least overall you liked it, right? I mean, something. So it passed the test, okay? He was debating in a paper that presented, our paper that was presented to appear in a Journal of Human Capital. So I do that, but I like to write papers. So, and then more recently, the previous government, there was the new Fundeb. What's the new Fundeb? The new Fundeb expanded the total amount. Economists don't like it, and then don't like economists that don't like it. Okay, because they're very superficial. They say, well, the country's not growing, what's that for? Wait, because if you fix all the other problems, no, the economy grows, then you don't want to have all these educated people around. So have to still increase, because it's having an effect on the years of education, and the quality is more or less constant. It's actually going up a little bit because the more people that go in the secondary school. So the overall is increasing, I think, because that comes more. But anyhow, it's even worse that it should be growing more, but it's not. There's several explanations for that. One is, well, I went over this. So it's a big problem in Brazil. And the new Fundeb gives more money and concentrated more in the more miserable country. So the more miserable people. That we did that. Guedes helped me pushing that. And I participate in the regulation of that. Me and the Congress is Rigoni. He was, and then I had all the help inside all my students, the army of students, in Brasilia, and also the people from the government. So I think it was a big improvement. You have to go over it, to finish this, because the more poor people are more affected. This paper that we see the effect, the very poor are not that much affected by the Fundeb, old Fundeb. So you have to go to the second stage, I think. You have to keep thinking that we are going to fix the problems of productivity, right? So just and again, Heckman was the mentor for me. He told me, invite this. So invite lots of neuroscientists, got some neuroscience from Brazil in the 80s, And so it was very helpful to do the way it should be done. Neuroscientists and psychologists and education people and Brazilians and foreigners. Oh, sorry. Oh, is that it? Yeah. Right. I got always confused. That's the bankruptcy law, okay? Like 20 years ago. I started working was Arminio and Sergio Vela invited me to Central Bank because I did the full in Bannock space. They didn't have anybody else. So, and then I learned the rules, the laws, and then it was very painful. And had advanced. The law that was there was awful, but we had changed that in the central bank, and then continue. Meirelles invited me to continue in the central bank. A lot of it was done with the stuff that we've been doing before. And then I have to tell you, I betrayed the economists. I went for the lawyer. The lawyer knew what's going on. The economists had some very strange idea. They say, the way to do it is a whole set of options. Give the firm to the most senior creditor and let the less second senior creditor buy the firm by the price of the credit that the both senior creditor had, and so forth. A whole set of options. It's a paper that had 10,000 citations. I don't know. But people laugh at me, and I start laughing at me, put myself in the mirror. How come I came with these ideas? So it didn't make any sense. You have to look at the lawyer. And I met this guy, Richard Levine, was a great guy that had reformed the American bankruptcy law. So I go the American ways, okay? Don't care. Economists didn't like American law either. So American bankruptcy system. I think they don't understand exactly what's going on. But anyhow, that's the way it was done. And was a big success. Not a big success, a moderate success. Again, moderate optimism. But there was a chapter 11 in Sin of Concordata. Sorry, Michele, we abandoned Mussolini, finally. 70 years after, Mussolini had been hanged, but he still, because there were some lawyers in Getúlio Vargas' dictatorship, there was influence by Mussolini, so they like, capitalism is bad, socialism, communism is bad, so you have to do something in between. What's it do it? Give to the state to decide, give to the power to the judge. That's a mess, right? So that's went to the chapter 11 way. The economists didn't like it. I don't care about the economists, but it's a good way. Nowadays, it's very accepted, much more accepted all over the world, okay? Even economists don't complain about this anymore. Too much. And then there was an extrajudicial mechanism. We introduced lots of things you could, lots of. It was a good group inside the central bank. It was since the Armenian time, continued to work. That was very interesting. There was extrajudicial system. We managed to do only in 20. The courts is still a mess, right? If you so you had to do extrajudicially. And then we did a little bit in 2005, but the main thing was done in 20. And it was a big helping. It's still lots of things going on wrong. But sometimes better not mess around, because what the current government did to send a law to improve this administrador judicial, that's awful. Increase the cost, and then it's very... But then what Congress did, it did something much worse than it was. And say, Daddy, don't mess around. Let it die, please. If I tell you the name of a politician did that, you agree with me. We had to let one of the law die also. We get to see the same thing. Because it was very bad. It was part of all the church debt. So you had to debt and go to another one. It's very tiresome to go over this. Each time it's lots of work, lots of thinking, and lots of energy. So just the... so credit recovery increased from 0.2%, you don't believe that, okay? But that's doing business, not my data, to 20% of GDP, of total debt. So it multiplied by 100. Time for judicial recovery was cut for 1/3. No, to 1/3, was cut 2/3. So that, I think, was a good accomplishment. No? According to doing business has lots of problems, but don't have any other data. We don't have the effect yet from them. I have 3 papers now. We did before that, me and Funchal, and then another one in corporate finance with Ferreira and Funchal, the effects of the law, the impact on credit, and so forth. And then more recent, labor effect of judicial bias in bankruptcy in Brazil. The rules of law, the rules of law. People say, rules of law is important, so let's read Hayek. Well, sometimes instead of reading all this, go to the numbers, right? And then you see that the facts are there, right? So publish this paper. My ex-students and some other people also, very good guys. Ponticelli worked before in Brazilian bankruptcy. So more recent constitutional reform, labor law, another Mussolini law that you have, Kelly. Not, I'm sure. How come it lasts 70 years? They, yeah, is the labor court. The labor court is still there. You hang Mussolini 70 years ago. The law was still there. Only now it's been removed. So it's not. It's the idea that the court should do. The judge, power to the judge. I don't know. Okay, good that you lose some time so I can go on. But the labor
this
law.
This thing is funny. Now it finally revealed itself. It has a little button down here. I didn't know there was all this Mussolini's thing in Brazil. I thought Argentina had been influenced by the Italians, so we made it even to.
No, there was some lawyers in Brazil law.
Oh, we send the lawyers. It's you that like the lawyers.
No. The judiciary, in Brazil, always been influenced by the Italian law and things like that, old tradition.
I see, interesting.
But at that time there were even some more reasons to follow the. So they imported these two body of laws, the Concordata, that's what destroy every firm, and the labor court, and then the power of the. So we mitigated that, but then it's coming back a little bit. Unfortunately, now it's, but still there. Okay, it's still improvement. I say you have to struggle with to fight more, to have better levels of. And then the pension reform is 2019 was very important. Was lots of saving. But unfortunately, if increase the minimum wage, increase the Brazilian system, destroy part of the benefit. But it would have been worse if you increase the minimum wage without changing the law, the pension system. That would be even worse. So but that's the pension reform. But pension reform, I don't think is like the labor law. Like, this is not economist's problem. It influence economy, right? But lawyers do that. The bankruptcy, it's different because lots of interaction between lawyers and. But the labor, there was and pension essentially, the way I look at it is a mathematical programming problem. You want to maximize the gains from the reform, given that it passed in Congress. So this is a mathematical programming problem. With a good politician, you know how to do maximize that. Don't go beyond a certain point, if not, it not pass. But the VAT reform, 2023 and 2024 is still being implemented. And that, I think, is a very economic problem, because what you did is to find some data, a natural experiment. We didn't publish that yet, but even send it. But because the Europeans have these rules, I was talking with Megale, it should be uniform tax across. Was Atkins Stiglitz idea, that be uniform across the goods, because you simplify the system. It's true, I agree entirely with that. But the problem, if you have much more evasion, according to in some goods than in others, it might pay off to have different rates, to go back to the Ramsey, the great Ramsey, that should be inversely proportional, not to the elasticity of demand, but to elasticity of evasion. And you estimate, have a natural experiment, when Cardoso II government, the increase, they could not fix the stop inflation. That was nice, but they didn't fix the problem that the revenue they're gaining out of the tax, inflation tax, had been substituted for something else. They just increased by 5% GDP the tax burden from 27 to 32. Kills you. That's why what the reason they don't grow, tax burden. Manuel was telling me that, is it true, Aloisio, that's 39 or 40% the tax burden in Brazil? Yes, if you count the deficit is, if you count interest rate also. A little bit less than that, I say, because if that's counting also the inflation that's in the interest rate, so it's a little bit less than, but it's more than 34. It's 36, something like that. It's very big. So, looking at this data, they increased the taxes, and the reaction, the evasion was very different than according to the sector that you're in. They did some econometrics there, no? With this data, the evasion after the increase was a nice thing because you have a control. It's interesting paper, okay? I'm not going over it. But I was telling Michele that what gave me an extra force, I was visiting Sardinia, no? And nobody was paying any tax on tourism. And some economists in Brazil, well, I understand you have a lower tax for education. Without education and health, you not pass it, just for political reason. But tourism is very well. Tourism should be one to go because nobody was paying the tax. I was in Sardinia, no? Renting a boat for a trip, or hotels and everything. It's amazing. The big guys pay, but the smaller guys don't. So it has to be. We've been a very nice group coming in. So it's okay. Okay, that's good. I was lucky to get with the students that were free from class. But I'm going over these reforms in Brazil, constitutional reform. All of this mixed the constitution. So that's one of the things that cannot just make a remark, okay, you might forget. People say, you have to open up the economy. I say, no, I don't think you should open. Oh, Luis, you're crazy. No, because there is a sequence of laws. You're going to close down some firm and going to open up another firm, right? If you open up the economy. And two, you have to transfer the labors that you own this firm to the new firms and the capital. So the good bankruptcy and a good labor law to do it in a less costly way. So there is a sequencing of laws. Even that. Kelly asked me to talk a little bit. I was talking with him. So it's what we are doing now. It is part of bankruptcy, part of labor. So nowadays, if we need to open up the economy for the current situation with tax and so forth, we are better prepared than 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So that's the... But the VAT passed it, no? I talked with Haddad and said, no, Daddy, this thing is not going to pass. And said, Aloisio, I gave you all the argument, I'm the finance minister. I said, okay. So when I look everything better, I say, oh, that now I think it's going to pass. I say, Aloisio, didn't I told you 10 months ago that I was the finance minister? Okay. So they negotiate Congress and that. Perhaps it's not perfect, okay? It was, lots of it was just pure lobbying. I'm not saying it's optional. But it has to be done in the multiple tax. India did that way. But I talk, no, some countries, even Europeans don't have a single rate. So anyhow, it was a big achievement. So it was a moderate optimism that I'm saying. Not with the fiscal, okay? The fiscal thing is a burden to everything. Even for the inflation target, okay? So... so let's go to the inflation target, okay? Let's be more, sorry, student, but now I become more technical, but that's the way it is. No, I have to. 10 minutes, okay. So it's to appear in AJ macro, so the paper is there, and then, but so I'm going a little fast about the model. Oh, how to set inflation target in the economy with high government debt burden. To start with, the burden, high debt burden depends on the country, okay? But if I look at the data, the inflation target varies according to the country. Chile, Turkey didn't dare to do the same inflation target as Brazil. Brazil didn't dare the Chile, and the Chile didn't dare to do like the US. So there was something behind it. I don't know. So this is to make a contribution to this. And I'm not going to settle this question, okay? But it's a contribution. Very few theoretical paper on that. There were some arguments that freedom like a negative inflation. And then, but that was being passed because the liquidity problem, right? The hedonistic price of hedonistic price that should be, I don't know, should not go all the way down to, there were 2% more or less what was agreement. There was a few people, I was arguing that if you have a high tax burden, you and had a tendency to have deficits, you should go a little higher. So that's the, not to change, sometimes say, if you increase, at increasing the thought experiment, if you're considering to set up the first round of inflation target. You see what I mean? It's not to change it in the middle of the game. Because there's a game going on here. You could look at this general clean model as a game of signaling, whatever. So you might signal that is a way of to spend more. And that's very bad, okay? It makes matter even worse. So let's make it very clear that there's something at the start of the period, although in the beginning of first Lula government, they increased and then decreased. But that time they had a very solid fiscal surplus, okay? And it's very different than now. So I'm not advocating that should increase now. Very clear, I always tell journalists that. Look at the inflation target. I was there. I was a consultant on the central bank when they started the inflation target regime. I was talking with Verlang and Arminio, or their consultant. And they put 8, 6, and 4. 8 was already gone. It was easy. 6 was final, 4. And then they consider how, and I was, since the beginning, was battling. Because I tell you what, I calibrated the Krugman model when you had fixed exchange rate. It's a different problem. But I calibrated. There was an interview with me 10 months before the speculative attack on the real. 10 months before. And it occurred. 8 months. I said, I'm going to be before election. And it occurred 10 years after I gave this interview. What the interview was to Celso Pinto, was the greatest, one of the greatest economic journalists in Brazil. Very good guy, and has a column there, Gazeta Mercantil. So it was something, since they started inflation target, I said, well, the temptation to do little less inflation will be too big. So I have to be thinking about this question. You see, that's early. I lived in Brazil for a long time. I see lots of dreams, illusions, not dreams, illusions, no? Price freeze, all sort of games, gimmicks to have low inflation that didn't work. And this stuff is bad. It's not the bad of people that do the policy. It's that intrinsic equilibrium. And the monetary council is not, Brazilian monetary council is not going to make everybody else behave. You're not going to make the judiciary behave, to make the Congress behave according to what they should be doing. The rest of the government behave the way it should be. That observation goes for the previous government and for this government. So it's very difficult. It's an environment. So, and so they put, and then there was, they put 4, 3.5, then was the anticipation of Lula that will do something wrong, so the inflation went up and then came down. and I was roving around 4.5. And I took that as indication where Brazil could afford 4.5. Perhaps 4.5, something like that. But you don't learn this thing, okay? The country is there. Any opportunity, you know, for example, you save money from the pension reform, you already spend on a higher minimum wage. You save money, and you already spend. You privatize some good, you already spend. It's equilibrium. It's a problem. And then you have Brazil, the government has a negative savings that perhaps, that's perhaps why it's not grow, because there's a negative, it's an enormous tax burden that squeeze the private sector, is a negative tax, is a negative savings the government has on the top of it, so it doesn't invest in infrastructure, so the human capital doesn't have companions to make the economy grow. Perhaps that's the way. I don't know. So let me go fast. So the debt to GDP is more or less constant. We modern economy, and the novelty that you have before, compared with the other people that thought, is that before people have a monetary dominance, fiscal dominance, that's it. And in your model, we developed a third region, that's fiscal fragility zone. Fiscal fragility appears when you have a relatively high risk premium, and appears in Brazil. Perhaps in the US, if you look at, because when I gave the first time I gave, Sims was in the audience. And I said, no, that's only for emerging market. I was afraid I was going to get so much stone thrown at me. And then Sims said, no, Aloisio, I disagree with this point, because it's valid also for developing economy. And you could understand my model explaining how the US, there was a partial default in the US debt, right? Because the president of the Fed did increase the interest rate to 10%. Did it? No. There was a partial default, unexpected inflation. It was people that have the assets in government bonds in the US, they get a hit. Not only in Brazil, in Europe, also in Japan. Japan, I don't know. Japan is a different country. But in Europe or England, and so the model is more general. But so there is this. So you raise the interest rate. I'm not saying raise it now, okay? Raising in the thought experiment when you're doing it the first time around, or the time that you're decreasing it. The fiscal fragility zone shift upwards. What you based here? Importance of the fiscal fundamentals to inflation. I didn't invent all this thing off my head. I mean, who I am. Okay, 2 minutes. So this is essentially the fiscal fundamental to inflation, the fiscal theory of the price level. Sergeant Wallace, Sims, Woodford. That's why when I gave in front of these people, they accepted it naturally. And also Calvo, sudden stop, the idea of sudden stop, and Colin Kehoe, the idea of, so anyhow, there's a model, there's a calibration, and the interest rate tends to be higher the lower the target is, okay, in a case like Brazil. And then we calibrate, and then the fiscal fragility, you can go escape from going back, and go up to the fiscal dominance. And then 6%, the expected inflation is 3.5, and then 100% toward. So it's.
Does your estimate apply also to the United States? Okay. Go back to that prediction. It's to conclude. I think we want to conclude on a moderately optimistic note. Can you get back to you had a prayer? before? Yeah. So you define the fiscal dominance zone, the one in which the debt level is 100% or more than GMP. And is that a model prediction or is that an estimate, or what is it, that 12.8%?
Which column you're talking
Here, last line, the very last line.
about? Oh, yeah.
No, I'm just thinking of United States.
Yeah,
these
that's
days.
that's my model, okay? That's the steady state of once you go to fiscal dominance, there is a steady state of inflation. It's a simplification of the model.
No, it's okay. But then the model predicts that when you have fiscal dominance, the inflation rate is essentially set as high as possible.
The central bank lose all the ability to change. The market do whatever they want.
All right, I think that would be a moderately optimistic conclusion for the talk. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's that was something. I calibrated this for the beginning.
I was just trying to put an ironic note on the number, Aloisio.
No,
I think 13% is not something to look forward to.
Yeah. No, it's a steady state inflation. No, I calibrate that for the beginning in 2003 or 2002, something like that, with the parameters there. I don't want to do it now because now I'm going to be in the spot, right? Even more than I want to be.
All right.
To give it a scientific contribution for this debate.
All right. Thanks, Aloisio. Thanks. Boss, what's the procedure? Should we have question and remarks? We have a panel coming up. Then,
Can I sit there?
please.
Yeah.
Sir. Well, as we assemble the panel, I would like to give you good afternoon. My name is Paulo Leme. I have the privilege to work for both institutions. I teach here at the University of Miami in the finance department, and I also worked as an asset manager at Securities. So I'm really honored to have a fantastic group of economists. Caio, please come in. Alberto, have a seat. I'm going to stay over here. Maybe if I'm lucky, I get a chair. I don't know. We'll see. But I mean, the idea is to, you were expecting something different, right? We started hitting you with environmental stuff, Amazonas. Yeah, finally, the moment of Selic. And the exchange rate has arrived, and that dynamics. So if you're waiting for that, you're going to have plenty here in this session. And it's an honor to have, these colleagues. And I think in the order in which we're going to tackle the comprehensive issues of the macro side, we're going to start with Marcos Chiliatto, who is the Executive Director for Brazil at the World Bank. Marcos, thank you for being with us. Prior to that, he also was at the IADB, where he also was at the board of executive directors, experience also at the UN, the Economic Commission for Latin America, CEPAL, and he's going to start with an overview of growth, trying to link this panel with the previous panel. Then we're going to go for the fiscal part, and maybe we can link it with Professor Araujo's fiscal dynamics. And I have my colleague from CISPE, Chief Economist Caio Megale, that also gave his contribution working both for the Brazilian federal government and also, I think, almost like in a country. I mean, being the Treasury Secretary for the city of São Paulo, that was quite a challenge, I guess, right? And then we're going to put it all together, how these things affect monetary policy, exchange rate policy. I'm going to have then Carlos Viana de Carvalho, with all his experience having been a deputy governor, the Central Bank of Brazil. Currently, he's the head of research, Kapitalo, a very important asset management firm in Brazil. And I think also worked at the New York Fed, where I think a lot of the intel, I think, gets worked out in the U.S. financial market. So I think it's quite a privilege to get that viewpoint. And also teaches Católica at PUC in Rio. And then my good colleague, a good friend, we worked together many years, Alberto Ramos. He is a chief economist for Latin America at Goldman Sachs. Prior to that, he worked at the IMF, also colleagues at Chicago. And Alberto is going to wrap it up, giving us an overview, from how the markets are looking at Brazil, both in the external markets and also the local markets as well. So without further ado, let me turn the floor to Marcos, please. Do I get it? I did get a chair, so I think I'm doing a good job here.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for a very kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here, and nice meeting you all, colleagues for the panel. Before I talk a little bit about growth, as you proposed, I also feel myself more on the optimistic side, like Professor Araujo was saying. But let me congratulate you for beginning a macroeconomic conference with the topic of the Amazon, of climate, because this is pretty much what Brazil is structuring as its development strategy. Brazil is trying to articulate macroeconomic stability or economic growth with social inclusion and climate. And Minister Haddad himself is very proud to say everywhere he goes, we had the G20 last year, and he's very proud to say that he's among the very few ministers of finance that, together with the Minister of Environment, is leading the climate transition. And here the task, the objective is really to combine the ecological transformation, the energy transition, with economic growth as a source or a drive of economic growth. So putting it to the past, this old-fashioned idea that protecting the environment is anti-growth. So we can actually use investments on protecting the climate, on the energy transition, into pursuing better jobs, higher levels of investment. So this is, I thought it was quite clever that we could start the conversation today with the Amazon or with the climate. And just then briefly to look back to last year or growth last year, I think everyone will agree that when we, at the beginning of the year, not only colleagues in the markets were projecting a quite low economic growth. I think the average of projection of markets was around 1.5% growth. Even the IMF, World Bank were projecting something below 2%. The Ministry of Finance was projecting 2.2% at the beginning of the year. And at the end, Brazil grew 3.5%, which is quite a positive result. It's among the highest rate of growth on the G20 economies. And not only the level was high, it's important to consider that the level was high given two very severe climate events that happened last year. You remember floods in Rio Grande do Sul, very severe impact, millions of people affected, multiple cities were impacted, and also droughts that impacted the agriculture. The agriculture sector dropped around 3% last year. So even under those circumstances, Brazil managed to grow 3.5%, which is, of course, why I'm also on the optimistic side as Professor Araujo. And the quality of that growth is also something to highlight. It's important to highlight that manufacturing, that's a sector that has been struggling for several years, had a positive result last year, and also investment. Investment grew around 7% or a bit more than 7%. So also the quality of the growth last year is something to keep in mind. And of course, this has a very strong articulation or dynamic with the agenda of social inclusion, reduction of poverty, family consumption picking up associated with that. In the labor market that reached the lowest levels of unemployment. I think that was on the economic growth side. Of course, there were challenges on inflation, especially more towards the end of the year. Internal shocks and also external. No? The exchange rate evaluation impacted inflation, of course. And there are challenges that we are all aware. On the fiscal side, the government has been responding. I think colleagues will here say it's not enough. I'm aware of that. But I think Brazil has built, even on the fiscal side, and we can discuss a bit more later on, has built a trajectory of adjustment, given that we do not need any radical shocks. This is my personal view. We do not need any radical shocks, given the situation we have. And then to be brief, Professor, for this year, I think the perspective for growth this year, everyone will expect a growth level that is below last year. The monetary policy tightening is already showing impact in cooling labor markets, services, but there are at least two things that everyone is already pointing that will be on the positive side. So of course, this will be on the cooling side. No, the service is already down, labor market down. Monetary policy tightening will impact growth, but there are at least two sectors that is already clear that will give a positive contribution. And this year, the agriculture will probably have a positive contribution. There's a huge expectation on the crops that are coming, especially on soy and corn, that is already coming in. And also the oil sector. Oil sector is it's becoming very important in Brazil, and in a couple more years, Brazil will be producing very close to 5 million barrels per day. So these two sectors will bring a positive dynamism to an economy that is, of course, cooling on other sectors. And then, of course, the question for what will be the growth when we get to the end of the year will be, of course, vulnerable to how the external side will behave. And I will, of course, make no political statement here, but of course, the new U.S. government is bringing uncertainty to multiple dimensions on the financial side and also on trade. And how these tariffs, or if we're gonna really enter a trade war or not, how these will impact the world economy is a big question mark to all of us. And of course, how this can drive financial flows, of course, is something that Brazil, like any other developing or emerging economy, is vulnerable to. So, in a 5 or 7 minutes that I have, I think this is probably the perspective for this year. I'm glad to discuss. I think colleagues will do a deep dive on the policy fiscal side, and happy to discuss it further. Thank you, Professor.
I have the slides.
I think we're going to have some slides also.
Yeah, so maybe it's better if I speak here, looking to the slides. But so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Paulo, for organizing this event. University of Miami, it's a great pleasure for us not only to be here, but also to sponsor also this conference. I'm chief economist with XP, and we have an important presence here in Miami as well. My idea here is very briefly to talk about the fiscal side of Brazil, not short term. I try to go to structural issues, and then we can discuss in the debate, Q&A, what are our expectations for this year or next year. But what is the problem here? Let's try the fiscal, in terms of macroeconomics, the fiscal situation is probably one of the key difficulties that Brazil has. And to try to illustrate that, let me go back on time. This chart on the left-hand side, it shows total expenditures, primary expenditures of central government. In black is net revenue, and yellow is total spending. So I divided in three periods. First, from 2000 to 2015, we could go back. We don't have good data, but in that time we had like this crazy race of revenues chasing expenditures. So expenditures are growing, and average of 6% in real terms. GDP was 3.4 on average. Revenues, expenditures 6, so almost twice as GDP. And revenues like 5%. So it's this crazy race. Then in 2015, hit brick wall. So we knew that eventually that wouldn't work anymore. And in 2015, we got over leverage, a very deep recession. Then revenues collapsed, like you can see. And then we entered a new period that say, we must do something about expenditures. We have to change that. And then we create this spending cap, okay? 0% growth in real terms. And then both lines flattened for a while. And that was the gradual adjustment, because the idea was that keep expenditures flat and let revenues grow, and eventually we would get back to the positive territory. But then COVID came. We were almost there. Then COVID came. And after COVID, especially after 2021, we got back to what we call the ancient regime. We go back to the previous trend of expenditures growing and revenues trying to pick up, to catch up with. So we got back to that, the yellow line going up and the black line try to catch up, but now with the different places. So yellow above, meaning that we got to kind of structural deficit that seems to be difficult to rebalance. And last year was quite telling on that sense, because last year, that was that jump in the black line, we had record high in revenues. So that country never got so many revenues from the private sector to the public sector as we got last year. And even though we end up with primary deficit. So clearly the problem is on the dynamics of the expenditures. If you go to the other chart, that's mandatory expenditures. And this is the root of the problem. So mandatory expenditures, like 15 years ago, represented 85% of total expenditures. So mandatory expenditures, 85%. You have 15% of room to maneuver, if you will, or some room to maneuver. Today is 93%. And after COVID, as I said, expenditures are growing at a faster pace. So this 93 is getting dangerously close to 95. It cannot get toward 100 because we need discretionary expenditure. So something has to happen. And by the way, the Minister of Planning, Minister Simone Tebet, gave an interview like 1 week ago that I fully agree. And she said, this is unsustainable. We need deeper reform on the revenue side, on the expenditure side, changing that dynamics of mandatory expenditures. Because they are not only grow, but they are rigid and linked to minimum wage, to inflation, to tax collections. So it's like a machine of increasing expenditures that has to stop eventually. We know that that's not going to happen next year, that next year is an actual, this year, very, very difficult. Next year is the election year. So the task will be delivered to the next president. So this is, in my view, the root of the problem. And by the way, in the recent years, this rigidity and this linkage of revenues to inflation got worsened with some laws, especially the minimum wage law, pensions, which is half of the primary expenditures, they are linked to the minimum wage, and now the minimum wage is linked to GDP growth, so it's almost impossible to have zero growth, real growth on expenditures with this regulation. So those are the themes that country has to face in the coming years. With this this back to the ancient regime and back to the negative territory in terms of primary deficit, that expansion on the fiscal side put pressure on inflation. Probably Carlos Viana is going to talk about that when he speaks. And with higher inflation, central bank had to react. We've been conducting a quite tight monetary policy, even tighter than this panel here. And with tight monetary policy means high interest rates. With high interest rates, nominal deficit skyrocketed. So we have today 80% of GDP, 8% of GDP in nominal deficit, which is the highest number except for 15 and obviously 2020 during COVID. And with that nominal deficit, debt to GDP ratio is on the rise, and we don't see that stabilizing anytime soon unless deeper reforms are conducted on the expenditure side. And has to be on the expenditure side because, as Aloisio said, Brazil tax collections is already quite high. This is total government revenues. I got IMF by the IMF definition. If I took World Bank numbers, would be a little lower than that, but it's around between 35 and 40% of GDP, which is probably the highest number among emerging markets. So, especially because of that crazy race that I mentioned during the 90s and the 20s and the 2000s, tax collection is already quite high. So we don't see room for collections growing up too much. On the contrary, what government is doing is like actually cutting taxes for the poor and try to increase more taxes for the rich. So I think that we have reached the limit on the expenditure on the revenue side. So the idea going forward is to discuss more openly, which is a very unpopular theme, which is reducing and rebalancing and rethinking expenditures in Brazil. So with that, I would like to stop, and then I'll come back on the Q&A session. Thank you.
Also, I'm going to use slides. This corner, because then I can look at the... Can I get the slides, please? Okay. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to share the panel with colleagues. I'll also talk a little bit more about not quite structural, but slightly lower frequency topics for monetary policy and interactions with fiscal policy. And then perhaps, if there's interest, we can discuss more short-run, sort of current conditions and maybe the most recent monetary policy decision and so forth. So just to set the stage, I'm going to eventually be talking about, a challenge to fiscal and monetary policy in Brazil. And I think that relates a bit to Aloisio's point on whether you can be optimistic or moderately optimistic or pessimistic regarding the future. And I think it's, my view at least, I'm on the camp that we really need to change the course of fiscal policy, like Caio just alluded to. And the extent to which you can be optimistic or not, I think eventually is very hard to separate from the direction of macro policies overall. And that, it's very associated with politics and elections. So I think it's hard to envision a path of the macroeconomy that will lead to favorable outcomes if we don't tackle the debt dynamics that Caio just illustrated. And for that, what's going to happen after 2026, I think is going to be key. Of course, for the central bank, trying to conduct monetary policy and bring inflation to target, it's challenging if you have a fiscal policy that is on an unsustainable path. And here there are two sorts of channels through, that I think matter. One is a more sort of cyclical channel that the government has been increasing expenditures a lot recently. Again, after a period where expenditures were kind of flat on a real basis, and now we're back to a regime where expenditures are increasing, and that has contributed to a very positive output gap in Brazil. So in Brazil, it seems that it's always hard to be 100% sure, but it seems pretty clear that we are operating above capacity, right? So the economy has been growing what seems to be above trend for a few years. Unemployment is very low. We're seeing some pressure on inflation. So it seems like cyclically, this expansionary fiscal policy has been a challenge to the central bank to control inflation. But whatever, cyclically, the central bank should go there and just raise interest rates and cool off the economy and try to bring inflation to target. But I think there are also more structural challenges that have to do with this debt sustainability issue that Caio alluded to, and I'm going to try to illustrate this with sort of an analytical object that I think is interesting in a couple of slides. So the central bank, just turning a little bit to monetary policy, the central bank is facing a challenging situation. It's very easy to see. You just look at inflation expectations in Brazil. In an inflation targeting regime, I think kind of the core idea is that, coordinate expectations and people look to the future and expect that, over some period of time, on average, inflation is going to run at that level. They make decisions based on those expectations, and that sort of helps the economy operate around that level of inflation. Right now in Brazil, expectations for very distant future, so beyond the horizons at which the monetary policy operates. So expectations for these longer run horizons are somewhat above target, as above target as they had been in the period between 2011 and 2016, where inflation expectations were de-anchored in Brazil. So the central bank, of course, faces a challenge to credibility. And here I'm going to start by just looking at a measure that I think is kind of interesting. A simple way to measure central bank credibility that I find analytically useful. So here, I'm going to be looking at basically the difference between what analysts or markets expect in terms of the peak policy rate, right? So the central bank has been tightening, has been increasing interest rates to bring inflation back to target. People have expectations of what that path looks like, and markets are trading, on bets, making bets on the path of that interest rate. So I'm going to be looking at the difference between those numbers, sort of the peak rate expected by analysts or the peak market pricing in the short end of the yield curve, compared to an object that I call this lowest required policy rate, which is very simple, is the following. See, I take the central bank's model and I look for the lowest path for the policy rate that's kept constant forever, that brings inflation back to target at the 18-month horizon. Okay, so it's a very well-defined object. You take the model, simulate, look for constant interest rate paths, and search for the one that delivers inflation on target. And that's sort of the lowest required policy rate, because in reality, nobody's going to jump immediately to that policy rate and keep it there forever. Typically, central banks tighten gradually. So because you're going to take time to reach that rate, you're going to operate sometime with a rate that's lower than that. So you're going to eventually have to do more. Okay, so that's the sense in which the lowest required policy rate. Yes, over the relevant horizon. Yeah, so the target at the 18-month horizon, okay? And I don't look beyond. So if you keep it forever, eventually you're going to getting lower inflation, but it's for the relevant horizon. You should, if you don't want to tighten more, you should at least do that rate forever, let's say. And that's the definition. So it's the lowest Selic rate that delivers inflation on target at the relevant horizon in the central bank's model if you keep it constant forever. And these are the objects, okay? So the red dots are these lowered required policy rate. The blue dots are the sort of highest policy rate envisioned by the market analysts. And the black dot is the market pricing for the highest rate at the short end of the curve. There are some issues when the expectation is of an easing cycle. So it's better to concentrate at the end. And what we see here is what I sort of think is a pretty critical loss of credibility in the following sense. Let me see if I can point. If you look at what had been happening since the central bank started tightening, in the middle of last year, is that with a couple of exceptions, there was some alignment between what people expected and what market was pricing, and this object, which is the minimum amount of tightening you had to do to bring inflation to target. But more recently, since the end of last year, you started seeing this gap widening between these objects, right? And if you look at the last point, and this was really updated just prior to this week's monetary policy meeting, what you see is that markets and analysts sort of price or trade an interest rate peak of around 15% per year. For those not familiar with Brazil, these are huge numbers. Yes, we do have high interest rates, both real and nominal, so it is 15% per year. But the model tells you that the central bank would have to tighten way more than that, close to 17.25% to bring inflation to target. Something has happened recently that I think this connection between sort of what is required to bring inflation to target, at least according to the model. Of course, it's just a model we can debate, and maybe you want to deviate from the model when you're doing policy, if you have good reasons for that. But there's this recent widening of the gap between the minimum you should do according to the model and what people expect and what markets are trading, that I think sort of reveals a lack of trust that the central bank will do what's needed to bring inflation to target. So I think that's kind of reveals the challenges. It's really a challenge to central bank's credibility here. And what's behind this, we can discuss more. Maybe, there are cyclical considerations. Maybe there are perception of some political constraints on what the central bank can do or not. But I think to some extent, at least, there is a fiscal dimension behind this situation, associated with Caio's sort of view that fiscal policy is on an unsustainable path. And here I want to just look at another sort of object that I find useful analytically. It's very simple, but I think it illustrates the challenge that we faced recently, right? And I call this fiscal monetary stress index, for the sake of a bit of marketing, okay? So the idea here is I'm going to compare two interest rates. One is this R star object. The idea is that, this is the interest rate, the real interest rate that when the economy is in equilibrium, inflation is on target, the output gap is zero, so the economy is operating at potential, so forth. The interest rate in the economy, the equilibrium interest rate is this R star, okay? And what the central bank does typically is to set the real interest rate in the economy, a bit above or below that rate to steer the economy towards this equilibrium. But the idea is that this R star depends on fundamental forces, technology, demographics, fiscal policy, a lot of other things. And this one is quite high in Brazil. I'm going to show you some data. Okay. The other object that I'm going to be looking at, I call this RD star. And D here is for debt sustainability, okay? So here, the idea is very simple. We usually think of debt dynamics, and we usually ask ourselves, what is the primary surplus that the country has to do to stabilize debt over GDP? I'm going to just flip that question a little bit. I'm going to take the primary balance forecasts as given, as produced by market survey of market analysts, And I'm going to ask, what is the real interest rate that's required to stabilize that, given those primary surplus? Okay, I'm going to call that RD star. So it's kind of the real interest rates that's consistent with stable public debt, given projections of growth and of primary results. And this gap is what I'm going to call this fiscal monetary stress index. The idea is that if stabilizing inflation and keeping the economy at potential requires a higher rate, so if R star is high, but the interest rate required to stabilize that is low, that gap tells you have a disconnect, you have a sort of a tension between fiscal and monetary policy. That's why I call this fiscal monetary stress index, okay? All data from the Focus survey, I take the longest forecast available or some average of long-term forecasts, so there are no opinions. My opinions are not here, it's just like what you know, the consensus forecasts are telling you. And these are the data, okay? So this is kind of R star. There's some volatility, it sort of extrapolates a bit what's happened cyclically, but we have this downward trend from around 9, maybe it was even a bit higher before in the early 2000s or in the beginning of Lula's first government, transition from Fernando Henrique to Lula's first government. It trended down, you know, some volatility there. It seemed to have increased during Dilma's time with, you know, very expansionary fiscal policy and quasi-fiscal policy as well. Then it trended down, perhaps, you know, in response to reforms that Caio alluded to. And more recently has been going up after reaching a very low level during COVID of slightly above 2%. And now it's around 6.2% is the latest number, okay? So if you look at long-run Focus forecast, they project nominal rate of around 10% and inflation at 3.8, if I remember the numbers correctly. So it's kind of 6%, let's say, roughly. And this is RD star, so this rate consistent with that stability. And that one, it trended up a little bit until the beginning of Lula's second term. And then it's been trending down. There's some fluctuation, but it's like close to the lowest levels we've had. And this one, I don't remember the exact number, but it's something around 3%, okay? So currently, if you look at this gap, which I call this fiscal monetary stress index, so it's just the difference, is at its highest level ever. The last number is sort of 3.5 percentage points, okay? 350 basis points. This is a measure of this disconnect between the rate that doesn't make the debt explode versus the perceived rate that on average the central bank is going to have to, you know, implement to keep inflation on target and the economy at potential. You can ask, okay, so how do we close this gap? How do we make you know, these policies consistent? Do we need to make a 350 basis point reduction to the real rate somehow? And it depends on all the structural factors. I think there's a huge role for fiscal policy here. If you implement fiscal reforms, you get some leverage because not only you reduce this RD star, so this rate that keeps that stable, but also you have an effect on the neutral rate if you change to a more sustainable fiscal regime. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to find like some stability here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paulo, and thanks everybody. I think it's an amazing presentations. You know, I'm going to be moderately pessimistic, you know, just to keep things, you know, alive. I thought it was a pessimistic, but it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. It's right. You know, I mean, there is an optimistic voice inside me. It's fading over time, but it's out there because the problems that Brazil is facing are problems that have a solution. We don't need to create a committee to analyze the problems that Brazil is facing, you know, low growth, low productivity, the problem of the fiscal, which is a stock and the flow problem at the same time. And from a market perspective, that is pretty well known. I would say that problem number 1, number 2, and number 3, it is the fiscal. and the nexus between that and monetary policy and financial variables, the pressure that puts on the exchange rate, on the interest rate premia, on risk premia. So everything seems to be conditioned by that original sin, which is the fiscal largesse, right? In a way, the debt to GDP is way too high for the level of income. The tax burden is way too high for the level of income and the level of the domestic savings rate. At the flow level, we're still running fiscal surplus, fiscal deficits of close to 9 percentage points of GDP, with a small primary deficit, but cyclically adjusted. Caio mentioning that, let's keep in mind that in 2024, growth surprised to the upside, inflation surprised to the upside, and yet, and we also had the effect of a number of revenue measures that had been approved over the last few years, yet still we run a primary deficit. So cyclically adjust that for me, and the number is actually pretty scary. So we have very high debt level and a very high deficit that piles up on the debt. I'd like just to make a few observations. Still, I apologize. I'm going to talk a little bit about the debt dynamics as well. I think there are important points. We published a paper about 4 or 5 years ago, just looking at country high debt level regimes versus low debt level regimes. There is a lot of discussion if we are or we are not under fiscal dominance, if we're going to experience a fiscal crisis. Fair discussion. I think we are closer. It's not necessarily that we are on an irreversible path to such, but we're certainly closer today than we were a couple of years ago. But that in itself, even if you don't experience your typical debt crisis, is not a source of great comfort. Because high debt is consequential from a macro standpoint. High debt impacts the performance of the macroeconomy. And we looked at a broader sample of emerging markets, of developed markets, and we found, not surprisingly, that countries with high debt, in which Brazil falls, they tend to grow less on average over the medium term. And the typical transmission through high real interest rates, financial conditions, everything that goes around it. We also found that countries with high debt tend to have a much more volatile macroeconomy. So the volatility of realized growth of interest rates, of inflation, tends to be much higher. And I don't need to preach that volatility is not a good thing, that volatility actually destroys welfare. We also found that countries with high debt level, that reduces the fiscal multiplier. And at high debt levels, the fiscal multiplier often falls into negative territory. The more you spend, the less you grow. Again, the financial conditions mechanism that you spend more, people smell that you already carry too much debt, you are adding even more debt, irrespective of the conditions that lead you to spend more. You become more nervous, real interest rates go up, aggravates the debt dynamics, your RD star comes down, assuming that the fiscal authority does not move. So that's a problem as well, because you basically lose fiscal policy as an instrument, to be used counter-cyclically to manage demand, because economies are subject to oscillations, to cyclical fluctuations. It's important to have an operational instrument through fiscal policy to manage the cycle. So that compromises, encumbers a little bit the use of fiscal policy. At the extreme, the multiplier becomes negative. And then at the extreme of the extremes, you fall into fiscal dominance trap, which is very difficult then to extricate yourself from. Right. Yeah. So that's the observation number one, that is like, it's like if you are in shape, but you're told to, now you have to run with a boulder that weighs 20 pounds, right? You may not stumble, because of it, but running with a boulder, makes you slower, you grow less. Running with a boulder makes your path more erratic, the macroeconomy becomes more volatile. And running with a boulder makes it more difficult to deviate from obstacles. So if you need to run fiscal policy countercyclically, if you have a boulder and you have to adjust because you have extra weight, makes it more difficult. After a while, you may get a little bit tired and the boulder crushes you. And that's kind of the fiscal crisis analogy I was making. The other thing related to fiscal policy, goes without saying that Brazil taxes too much, spends even more, and invests too little. So there is a question here beyond the sheer amount of spending, which is how much we actually invest. And the numbers are quite striking. Brazil spends 44% of GDP. Yeah, 8% of GDP is interest, but your neighbor is not going to pay the interest bill for you. You still have to pay it. Just because it is interest is not, less so of an expenditure than other things. right? But if you take that out, you're still, dealing with 36%. Caio had a very interesting one that shows that, primary spending is probably higher than the average of the OECD, is an extraordinarily high level, and so is the tax burden. How much do we actually invest? If you look at, the official statistics, what is the gross fiscal capital formation that comes from the public sector at the three levels, federal government, states and municipalities, you would realize that, total investment is 240 billion reais. If you convert that into dollars at 575, we're talking about total investment of $40 billion. A reminder, the Brazilian economy is more than a $2 trillion economy. So we're talking about, a huge tax burden, spending 44% of GDP, and yet public investment at the three levels is only 2 percentage points of GDP. Net of amortization, that's probably like between 0 and 1%. So we're not spending enough. So if you could at least rejig the spending for less current spending, which obviously has much lower multiplier effect in the economy, to investment spending, which traditionally has much higher multiplier effect in the economy, short and medium term, that would be a good thing. Now that's the bad news. I saw a recent study produced by a consulting firm in Brazil that basically replicates results, corroborates results from a similar exercise we did about 5-6 years ago. Which is, the public sector is going to spend more. Is that a good thing? And we have seen an increase in public spending in investment spending, public investment spending, over the last few years. I mean, the theory is that, of course, if you spend more, you add to the stock of capital, public capital, infrastructure, all the good things that the public sector does for society in general. That should make private capital more productive, so the marginal productivity of capital of private investment goes up. Ergo, that induces and stimulates private investment, right? That is the other channel that in a country where you already spend too much and the pool of savings is limited, if you don't cut other types of spending to spend more, you put pressure on the pool of savings, you push interest rates up, and that is your typical channel of the crowding out. The public sector spends more, crowds out private spending, which then boils down, where is the investment multiplier higher? Is like public spending or private spending? I think you know the answer to that. But what the results show in a VAR, I think it's quite striking. You shock public investment by 1 standard deviation or 1 percentage point of GDP, and see, what happens to private investment? Is this a catalyst, an inducer to private investment? And the answer is pretty disappointing. You see public investment picking up, and the effect is only in the short term. There is nothing in the long term. So asking the public sector to spend more, it seems to have a very limited impact on private investment in Brazil. That's pretty disappointing, because if we say, like, if they only could spend more in infrastructure, we know the stock of infrastructure has aged and is small, and the results show that actually they spend and not much happens. And if you run the same VAR on the impact on growth, it's just a few hundreds, maybe 0.03, 0.04, very, very small numbers. Again, comes from, the crowding out effect seems to be dominating, the financial conditions effect seems to be dominating. So, now what we observed also in recent years is that there is more investment taking place at the local level, states and municipalities, than at the federal level. It's an open question. We're going to be looking at it relatively soon. Who invests better? Where is the multiplier higher? At the federal level or at the local level? We have a prior, but we're not going to spoil it. And the other open question is, can we actually increase investment even if it does not have a major, diffusion effect in stimulating private investment or leading to an acceleration of growth without increasing the budget deficit? Because if you invest more by borrowing more and having a 9% of GDP deficit, that has other types of costs and starts to also have an impact on the current account deficit. So the external constraint very quickly becomes binding every time investment goes up. Just to finish, from a market standpoint, what is really shaping investors' views is this dysfunctionality between fiscal and monetary policy. Monetary policy did a fantastic job in hiking rates aggressively, and I may disagree that monetary policy was very tight. It was very tight in steady state terms. It was not very tight because it didn't see the effects of tightening. And the culprit of that is definitely not monetary policy. It was that, monetary policy was pushing in one direction and fiscal policy was pushing in the other direction, which made monetary policy much, much less powerful than under normal circumstances. And it was the resistance of the administration, of the fiscal authority to embrace tighter fiscal policy that made the market very nervous. There was a little bit of a market tantrum in December where the exchange rate went to 620. The market curve basically, moved up significantly. Risk premium went up. The ill-fated announcement of the fiscal package. Things calmed down since then. The exchange rate come back. The former governor, left us a gift in the sense that he kind of committed to push rates, 3 rounds of 100 basis points. So he added carry. People were demanding more premium, and now they see the premium. And volatility came down a little bit, and the currency came back to it. So it shows that actually monetary policy works. It was being short-circuited by fiscal policy, but doing the right thing, which was somewhat aggressive calibration and aggressive signaling, produced what's supposed to be. The currency is today trading at 575, closer to fair value, not at 620. That has nothing to do with the expectation that fiscal policy is going to get, much better, over the next few years. So your RD star, I think it's a very appropriate metric to look at this. Nobody expects the fiscal authority to move, and the central bank will do whatever they can do. There are certain limitations what they can do. The market thinks that inflation will remain visibly above the target over the next 2 or 3 years. So do we, because you don't expect the fiscal authority to change. That will impact growth capital formation. And so the market is now kind of, trading the premium. We still see modest growth profile going forward. We see the central bank continuing to hike in the second quarter, eventually coming to a peak rate of 15% or about, right? And then we'll see when exactly the stars align so that the central bank when the central bank could eventually start to cut rates. So high inflation, no progress on the fiscal, a relatively modest growth profile. I'll take a little bit of an issue with the initial characterization on growth. DEFTA 3.4 was a good number for historical standards. There was the floods in Rio Grande do Sul, but there was also a lot of spending in Rio Grande do Sul that sustained GDP and activity. I think, the 3% plus growth outcome to celebrate that we saw over the last 2 years was to a very, very significant extent a direct consequence of profligate fiscal policy. Like the fiscal policy was way too expansionary, and there was, idle capacity in the economy. And the ultimate proof of the pudding that that is not sustainable is the fact that you see the current account deficit increasing and you see inflation re-accelerating, right? So it means that, 3% is great, but 3%, unfortunately, it's not sustainable. There were some reforms, but for a potential GDP, maybe like between 2 and 2.5, but certainly not above 3%. Just final comment, I'm already overextending myself here, which is related to the fiscal targets. And there is a lot of, there was a little bit of a market disappointment that the authorities were not able to convince themselves to deliver a higher fiscal target, despite the macro consequences of so. Came up with a package that was disappointing. There were like maybe 14 measures to yield 0.1% of GDP. When you have a table with 14 entries to deliver 1 percentage point of GDP, you're not in a good place. And I think Brazil needs more ambitious targets for 2 main reasons. Reason number 1 is that the targets, as we see, for the next 2 years, do not guarantee debt stability. And that's problematic because the debt is already too high. So the targets are not ambitious in absolute terms, and the speed at which they will improve over the near term, over the next 2 to 3 years, right? And that GDP will continue to climb up, and I'm gonna come back to what I mentioned at the beginning. High debt regimes have consequences even if you don't have a fiscal crisis. Even if that was not a problem, it is a problem, but for the sake of discussion, even if the targets were not necessarily leading to, to further increase in public debt, from a cyclical standpoint, you need more ambitious targets because the economy has overheated, because the output gap is positive, because the labor market is operating beyond full employment, below the Nairo. So we have two strong reasons from cyclical management and opening extra degrees of freedom for the central bank to calibrate policy at a less restrictive way. And you also have the more long-term trajectory of the debt that requires high public debt. I think that justifies why I'm just moderately pessimistic.
Well, Alberto, you know that you just set the panel on fire, no?
Yeah.
Since you made a lot of comments about different sectors, I mean, maybe I'll just be kind of selfish to just go around if the panelists would like to have comments, maybe Marcos on the growth side, and also as a curiosity, where do you see the speed limit of the Brazilian economy today? Everything else constant. I mean, what is the potential GDP growth of Brazil? Is it coming from productivity? What are the contributions to that factor?
Oh, thank you. Let me going back to the fiscal. I think there'll be no disagreement on the need to fix the fiscal side. I think where people disagree is on the speed, right? And then the political economy dimension is critical on that. I think there was an IMF paper early this year showing that last year Brazil was among the 2 or 3 highest fiscal adjustments last year, because if you consider in terms of GDP, it's still on the expansionary side, but the efforts were there. You can also say it's not enough, not big enough, but the fiscal rule is in place, is delivered. The primary deficit was 0.4, if I'm not mistaken, so it's still there. But I think we need to, it's really important that we bring the political economy dimension to that. I think we have enough experience in Latin America on the challenges of driving radical changes into those variables. And the thing is that Brazil made this effort of dropping half the fiscal stimulus without compromising the advances on the social side. So Brazil managed to deliver growth and adjustment. You can say not enough, but I think it's important that we bring this dimension to the debate, because if the risk is if you push harder on delivering and fixing in 1 year, then you put at risk the adjustment sustainability itself. And we've seen that many times in Brazil, in Argentina, in many of our countries. And I think here it's important how we measure, how you implement this fixing the trajectory of expenditures. It is also important to disaggregate what is under the expenditure variables that we look at. And then over there will be lots of agreements on different types of expenditures, the dynamics of each one of those. And my view is that the government or the fiscal authority is trying to tackle several of those, trying to improve the dynamics of fiscal expenditures. So I think that will be maybe my disagreement to what you present, that I think everyone is seeing the same diagnosis, but here the challenge is how do you build a trajectory of adjusting it that it's sustainable itself, considering all the complexities of Brazilian politics and Brazilian society. Here the risk is that if you jump into a fiscal adjustment in 1 year, 2 years, you will not only harm the GDP, but harm the trajectory of it. So, and from this point of view, the efforts that the government is being, I don't want to speak on behalf of the government, but it is trying to build a very strong coalition among a very complex Congress without having a majority on Congress, and trying to build an agenda into building a midterm adjustment for the fiscal side that combines overcoming long-standing practices that were giving fiscal privileges to many sectors, so trying to fix that, but also on the expenditure side. And this is an agenda that demands a lot of work, constant work, trying to deliver a result that will not drive the economy into a social shock or a political shock. So here the challenge is how to tackle that. This is perhaps where the disagreement is in Brazil, how to drive a sustainable path And then we, of course, need to bring the political economy argument.
Caio, I think I can see you that you're jumping on your seat. So I think you're going to address the fiscal issue, but as a trader, I mean, it's like, am I getting paid? You know, when you look at the NTNBs and you look at the back end of the yield curve, I mean, it's like you're getting real rates that you don't see anywhere. I don't think that the exchange rate, is expensive. Maybe it's like slightly cheap. So carry plus 5 or 10 percentage points of appreciation. So, I mean, despite of everything that we've heard, I mean, for local currency investors, I mean, is that a good trade or not?
Good. Let me just make some comments here and then tackle that question. One is on interesting that you mentioned about investment. I didn't talk about investment, but actually when I was talking about mandatory expenditures versus discretionary expenditures, investment are discretionary expenditures. So that squeeze that I showed that from 85% of total expenditures to 93 actually was squeezing investment. So that's the point. There are current expenditures, wages, social security programs, all very important. I've been in the government. We know that every expenditures are important. But when we look at current expenditures taking almost all the space in the budget, including investment, he said that's unsustainable. That's gonna we're gonna have a problem down the road. And then I was listening to you, and I fully agree. It's a problem of Brazilian society. It's not a problem of Brazilian government. It's not Fernando Henrique or Lula or Dilma or Bolsonaro or Lula again. Actually, when I was doing that exercise that I showed, and it looked to me like we had that trend before. So Brazil expands. Brazilians believe that government has to spend, has to transfer. So this is in our DNA. And it was like an alcoholic, addicted to that. So when we had the spending cap, the spending cap was a very gradual policy to adjust the fiscal target. If you remember my chart, you had fixed expenditures and revenues were growing gradually. So we are still running deficits. So lower, narrowing and narrowing until... But I remember that period was just like an alcoholic that stopped drinking. And for a non-alcoholic, spend one day without drinking is like every day. But for an alcoholic, and I know some, it's like... No, seriously, it's a very serious... it's day after day. It's a struggle. And we felt during that spending cap years, that was like every day, it was like painful, and it was gradual. And then it seems like after COVID, it was like a release. I get back to the bar, I'm drinking again, I stopped shaking, and so we look at that and say, there is a structural problem. It's much deeper than paper discussions and something like that. And that's what I think that the next government will have to discuss internally and with the society openly. And so the next president will have to use his political capital gaining during the election to discuss with Congress, to show the society that problem, we are kind of reaching a very dangerous limit. So in terms of rates, so we look at the markets and say 7% real interest rates for 30 years. Like, it's a no-brainer. We're buying that. And Brazil has a good thing that maybe is a problem to the point that I was mentioning before, which is we think in reais. We invest in reais. We live in Brazil. We don't plan to live abroad. We Brazilian, most of us, we don't plan to live abroad. We plan to spend our money there. So 7% in reais for me is everything that I need, because I don't care about dollars. I care about spending my money there in Brazil. This is a good thing because don't put pressure on the government. We don't have those old debt, external debt crisis, but at the same time, it's like we know that eventually government will print money and will pay me back. So it's good in the short run, but it may be a kind of a curse over time because it allows the government to keep on rowing that ball. But I hope to get paid on my papers.
I'm getting pressure here from Alex, but I mean, I'd like to give Carlos the opportunity also to wrap it up from the monetary policy side as well. Then I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so I think the key point are these more structural challenges that I talked about. Cyclically, I think, as Alberto, illustrated or alluded to, I kind of agree with him. We're going to live with, quote unquote, very high interest rates for any standards, but not enough to do the job and really cool off the economy enough to bring inflation to target. So it looks like that's the baseline case. So it's a scenario where the economy is going too slow. We have that baked into our forecast. Inflation is going to remain way above target, high, real rates high. So it's kind of cyclically, it's a bit of a hangover from having these above potential growth more recently, and this more fundamental issue of unsustainable fiscal policy is going to show up with slower growth, high inflation, high rates, but not achieving in the end, I think, any of the goals. I think inflation is not going to go to target. Fiscal policy is not going to move really in the direction of stabilizing that, and we're kind of waiting for a change, and that has to do with political economy. I totally agree with that.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I don't think it's on.
Hello. Okay, thank you very much. I want to open the questions to the audience, but I wanted to start with the first question. I want to take a little advantage of the privilege of having the microphone, and it's because it's not directly related to the Brazilian economy, but I have this new position as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies. I'm very keen on education, and I want to take advantage that we have a giant of economic research and education in the floor, Aloisio. So I wanted to ask you showed that Brazil was lagging in economic education, was ahead in math and physics, but somehow lagging, and now Brazil catch up. So what do you think it's needed to create a great economist, to give to our students the skills to become great economists, given your experience?
Yes, the reason that I did that is that I present as moderate optimist, because of many things improved in Brazil, Moderate in the sense of the border view is not the current short term. And then Brazil was very latecomer in terms of higher education. Brazil had the first university only in the 20th century. And there was a few scientists that started doing science in Brazil that was very late. Argentina already had 2 Nobel Prizes. But then when I compared that, the natural science were in good terms in terms of Latin America, but the economists were well behind. That's why I put these numbers there. And now, 3 of the 4 best research places in Latin America in Brazil. So we got, because I think we need good economists. All these questions that appear, we need to do research, to think about it. The Indians, for example, they did many reforms, but they had good economic training in England. And I think that's, I'm a little more optimistic because now we have good economists thinking about poverty. I was thinking the longer view, But macro, the question that we're discussing here, I think I try to contribute a little bit, the inflation target, because connecting with your panel, like saying that it's very hard to converge because the need of the interest rate so high that's going to hurt also the fiscal side. Nowadays Brazil has a 15% interest rate, approximately, and then the debt to GDP is deteriorating. So perhaps the next to solve the question to be posed here, if you devise a new fiscal situation connecting with increasing the target, no? Not now, the way it is. It has to be first a big push for the fiscal. The fiscal has to come first. Not the target making everybody behaving like you need it. No, the fiscal come first. And then after that, adjusting the target might be a solution for the, not a solution, but to be alleviating the, but you need research in economics in Brazil. That's my...
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, hi everyone. So I think that we all felt the same in December when the real touched 620. And I was personally forecasting 560, 570. These things goes to 620. Throw the towel. That's it. There's a country with an $85 billion trade surplus. You get 620. There's a currency crisis. We're going to have a huge crisis in the first quarter. Brazil right now plus 11%, the Bovespa in dollars, the Nasdaq is 10% down, the real is 568. So the key question is, and I keep on wondering myself, is this a peak dollar trade? Is this a Trump not being Trump trade? Or is this a 2026 pre-election trade? I mean, regime change, Argentina type of return, some form of Milei in Brazil coming up. What would you say?
Again, quickly, just in 1 minute, I think it's all of the above plus. I think, the interest rate shock that, the central bank, was able to embrace, there was a bit of seasonality in the flows in December. Was very fresh at that time that the fiscal authority was not doing more than that. There were some questions about whether the target for 2025 was feasible. I think people are now more comfortable with the target. I repeat that the target is not a great target, but at least, it seems that there is a higher probability that we'll be meeting that target. And then there is, maybe, I'm not sure it's a peak dollar. We're not calling for a peak dollar, but there was like a little bit of a dollar relief. That since inauguration, Trump was a little bit slow off the marks and maybe a little bit more chaotic in the delivery of what is the new tariff architecture. The U.S. exceptionalism, is also being questioned. So from that standpoint, the stars have aligned. Higher carry, low vol, a little bit more confidence that at least it's not going to be worse than this target. The insurance cuts by the Fed. So I think all that, protected the currency, and we're saying, and our models show that it is right now slightly cheap to fair value.
I agree with Paulo. I think there are all the ingredients. Also, I think that there's some evidence of the 2026 sort of hope trade, let's say, if you put it that way. Because like the recent news with Lula's popularity really tanking, it seemed like the high frequency response suggested markets also, got a bit enthusiastic because of that.
I'd just like to reinforce the role of the central bank, Brazilian central bank on that. In December, we had that big debate if we were under fiscal dominance or not, if the central bank should react or just let it go because it was all about the fiscal and the central bank. It's not because you're here, Roberto, but the central bank did a tremendous job in saying, we have a role, we are not in fiscal dominance, we have to react. That's our role, and the reaction was amazing. In the following day, market was still like a bit lost, so there was this feeling that it's not working, but over time, it paid off.
There was also another thing, which is a lot of companies were afraid that there will be a tax on dividends on the following year. And for that reason, a lot of companies anticipated sending money out to pay dividends. Actually, some banks were doing this operation with companies in which they lend money to companies They did a reverse flow so that the money gets into the company, they pay as dividends. But then once you pay the dividends, when you send the money out, you don't want to have the carry against you. So part of the money that was sent out in December had to go back in the future contract in January, because you want the money out, but being out, you want to have the carry of the real. So I knew part of the money that was going to be sent out would reverse in January, and that's, I think, part of the effect on the top of everything that you said.
Okay, we have that very, very short, very compact. Question? Oh, or Artur, Alex, over there.
1 second.
I tried.
Thank you. It's a quick one. Coming from the engineering world, it seems that Brazil keeps running after hysteria, because investment infrastructure is never there, right? So I would like your perspective, if there is a possibility to change it, because the 4% or the 2% have been around for many years, and look at this government investment, there is none, right? We don't fix the aging infrastructure as we don't build new infrastructure. So logistics get in the way. There is a problem with logistics, so cost. So I'd like to hear a little bit about there is a light at the end of the tunnel, or we keep doing the same.
Anybody cares to take this curveball?
Infrastructure is a great challenge for Brazil and mostly Latin America. I think Bill is the chief economist of the World Bank for LAC. I think he can say a bit on his panel as well. But currently, Brazil is putting in place PAC. PAC is a program for mostly investments in infrastructure, most of it on public resources. I agree with the colleagues that the level of expenditure on infrastructure is low, but there is an effort on expanding it. And there are multiple efforts around. Brazil has just launched a platform which is trying to congregate all the investments on the energy transition. So they call it BIP. It is a way trying to coordinate private investors, multilateral banks, multiple types of financing into meeting projects on infrastructure that are available for financing. It's a great agenda, but I think that the efforts really are there, and Brazil is really leading the agenda on climate financing. It's one of the most important countries globally in attracting financing for the energy transition. So I think there is a long-standing work on this agenda.
Thank you, Marcos. Artur, you have been granted by management a FIFA free card on extended time. So.
Brazil is this, bad fiscal trap, low growth, kind of equilibrium, but we collect risk premium, right? But is it really an equilibrium, right? I mean, is it an unsustainable situation? That's the problem, right? Because, I mean, these are two very different investment conclusions, right? If we are just in a low growth trap and collect risk premium, that's fine. But if that is unsustainable, then it is not an equilibrium, right? And we should not collect risk premium for long, right? I was wondering if you guys could elaborate on that.
Anybody cares to pick this one?
It's hard to tell, right? So if we tell you the government is going to pay 7.5% real rate for 30 years, it's okay. It's not gonna happen like that. You cannot predict the end, but I think there's always I think that why it is kind of an equilibrium, at least for some times, is because there's always some probability of self-correction, right? I think when we hit a wall in 2015, the country said, okay, let's do something about this, constitutional amendments, spending cap, and so forth. I was also on the hopeful camp that this was going to show its value, but then the pandemic came and we sort of got sidetracked. So I think we're going to alternate for a while. Maybe it will need to get worse before the country really understands. So look, this is not going to end well, and we do need to make some tough choices here in terms of fiscal policy. But I agree with your basic point that 7.5%, if you think of that as premium over 30 years, is not going to work. I mean,
Caio, I think you.
I came back to the point that since it's in the national currency, you have more time to adjust. If it was in dollars as it was in the past, you would have a heart attack. This is more like a long-term disease that you can fix at some point, but I fully agree that at some point you have to fix it. And it comes back to your point, the model that you showed. So it's only sustainable if our D star is the same or above the R star. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem eventually.
Well, I mean, I think we could stay here for another hour discussing, these exciting topics, but I think we're going to have a 10 minutes break, coffee break, and I can guarantee you that the best is still to come. Thank you very much for the panelists. Revolucionou o painel. Obrigado, Caio. Great, muito bom.